Alright, we're going to talk about the history of Southern Africa, and there's quite a bit packed in here, so we better get started right away. Driving question, which we will not really see until the end of this presentation, but I want you to think about how do we end discrimination and bias. Now, you know what those words mean. We're going to talk about them quite a bit in class. We'll talk about it a little bit in this video. So, several learning objectives there. We're going to talk about Nelson Mandela. We're going to talk about the early kingdoms of Southern Africa. Quite a lot going on here. So let's kind of jump in. I'm going to kind of go pretty quickly over this, but at this point, hunters and gatherers eventually began to farm, and this is what kind of created civilizations. The same was true of Southern Africa. Some trading was going on, even trading with China and India and Persia in Southern Africa. They would have access to not have to go all the way around Africa to get to Asia, so they'd be about halfway there already. So you can see kind of that it would be easier for them to travel like that. One of the first kingdoms was called Great Zimbabwe. Now there's a country called Zimbabwe, and that's kind of where it gets its name from, this kingdom. They were the Shona people. They were a pretty powerful kingdom that existed about 900 CE. Their capital was called Great Zimbabwe. That's kind of often how they're named, instead of just calling them the Shona people. About 20,000 people live there, which is decent size for this time period. There are some ruins that you can see even today in this area. There's a video on this we're not going to watch right now, obviously, with this national monument. It's the largest city in Southern Africa. It was a major commercial center. Not too much else I want to talk about there. This other group, the Zulu Empire. Zulu are kind of interesting because they kind of rebel. Their leader's name was Shaka, and he, around the 1800s, just wasn't going to tolerate this British imperialism that was coming in. We've already talked about imperialism at this point. You know what that is. And so they fight back. The Zulu were extremely warlike and had conquered most of the area around them, so nobody wanted to mess with them. But Britain is a different story, because Britain's fighting with guns and cannons and things like that. I think they even had like the Gatling gun at this point, and the Zulu people were fighting with spears and shields. So they're greatly outmatched. So here what the Zulu people look like. You can see they're holding their shields right there. And going against a superpower at this time with a major army, and it just really didn't go well for the Zulus. So they are defeated, and Britain takes over this area. And so today in South Africa, we'll probably talk about this more in the third video for this unit, but a lot of the people are of British origin. A lot of people are white in South Africa, the country of South Africa. Speaking English, pretty common. So it kind of comes back to this British occupation that would happen here. One of the first settlements was the Cape of Good Hope. It was settled by the Dutch. The Dutch were another one of the superpowers at the time. That's the country of the Netherlands. And they're going to be a superpower for a number of years, and then they eventually kind of just fade away. That's kind of a story for another day. But yeah, so they were the first ones that kind of settled this area and trade. After settling, the Dutch became known as the Boers, which is the Dutch word for farmers. They grew wheat, they had raised cattle, they used slaves. Some were coming from Asia, and then they also used some from Africa. But there became this kind of like fight between the two, obviously, because now the Dutch are trying to take over land, and then the Africans are defeated by them as well. So the British are then there, and now the Boers are there. So you've got Dutch influence, you've got English influence, and you've got the Africans there already. And so there's this kind of a conflict over them in this area. Kind of telling the story pretty quickly here, but there's other groups kind of involved. When I get to the part where we talk about the Afrikaners, so these are some other countries and getting their independence. And then South Africa's independence came in 1910. A majority of the population was black Africans. The minority was white Europeans. But there is a pretty substantial population of white South Africans in the country of South Africa. But there was definitely the minority kind of had the wealth, kind of had the power. In 1948, a new Afrikaner, which is the Dutch, took power and created a system known as apartheid. Now, this is probably one of the biggest things you need to know. It comes back to that driving question about bias and discrimination. So apartheid is Afrikaans, which is kind of like this European idea, this Dutch influence, meaning apartness. You can kind of almost see the word apart. You know, if you come up here, look at the beginning of the word. Apart, you can kind of see it in there. So it means the separation of races. Blacks were separated from other people. They had to live in designated areas called homelands. They were denied the right to vote. They had limited educational and economic opportunities. There's some videos here that would be really great to watch. We're going to talk about Mandela here in a second. I want to kind of fast forward to this slide and I'll come back to Mandela. But this kind of shows you, so just like in the United States where there was like separate white and black restrooms and water fountains and schools, the same thing was done here. Very, very similar in a lot of ways. Students often, this picture here on the right, kind of just shake their heads at this because the stairs go to the exact same place. Like, why do you need to do this? Well, it's all about making somebody feel less. So Europeans only could use that one side. All the Africans had to use the other side. A few more here. This one's on the left. Basically, just a really bold message about you'd be shot if you were in this area. You can kind of see here this guy, interrogating these few Africans with a gun. It wasn't just blacks too. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on, maybe in class. Notice that it says Indians here. Now, this is not like Native Americans in our country. This would be people from India. One of the biggest examples we're going to talk about is Gandhi later on. Gandhi, a very famous Indian, lived in South Africa and was discriminated against. So it wasn't just blacks, but this great discrepancy between the rights of people. So bias, discrimination, prejudice were all exhibited here. So this is Nelson Mandela. You've probably heard of him before. He was the head of the African National Congress. So he led it in 1962. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison, basically for just being a leader of this organization. He didn't kill anybody, didn't really break any laws. He would be in prison for 27 years on an area called Robben Island. And we may look at some pictures of that in class. So this is 3 different prisons here. Robben Island, I think, is maybe the one he spent most of his time at. This is him standing in his prison cell after he's released. So after 27 years, he's released. And we'll kind of fast forward in the story here. So he becomes president. So he's released in 1991. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. He helped kind of restructure and start making equal rights for blacks. And he gets elected in 1984 as president, mainly because black Africans were now given the right to vote. He is seen as kind of the Martin Luther King Jr. of his country. He is was a worldwide kind of well-known figure for what he did. This is kind of the story of Nelson Mandela. This is the South African flag there. And then there's a movie Invictus that came out sometime in the last 5 or 6 years, I think. Has Matt Damon in it, and then it kind of is roughly the story of apartheid. It's mainly a story of rugby too, but it kind of blends together. So it's a great movie to watch if you want a little bit more about this. It's pretty decent. And I think that's the last slide. So kind of big details here. Knowing apartheid, knowing who Nelson Mandela is, it's significant that he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. That's a big deal. Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize as well. They give one out a year. They give them for various things, but the Nobel Peace Prize really goes to one person. Barack Obama did win it a couple years ago, whenever he was president. Side note. So that's really, really important that you know that, and just this whole idea of apartheid and what that meant. We're going to talk a little bit more about bias in class and discrimination, maybe how we see that playing out in other cultures. But this is probably one of the biggest times we're going to talk about that here. today, pretty equal opportunities, I believe, for whites and blacks, especially in South Africa. But a lot of that was ushered in here by Nelson Mandela. So he is probably the center point of this second video, and just what I really want you to know, and just the kind of the key details surrounding his life. And in class, we're going to look about comparing him with Gandhi and comparing him with Martin Luther King Jr. Similarities and differences that we'll talk about. So thanks for watching.